Okay. Are we all right to start, Janine?
Yeah.
Fabulous. Right, thanks so much for coming today, everybody. Claire and I are going to talk a little bit about working with older perpetrators of domestic abuse using 2 case studies from some research that Claire did. Just to say, we've just, it's Claire's research, Claire did the empirical stuff, but we've sort of jointly written this up for a book chapter, which is coming out imminently, I think, in a new book about older perpetrators of domestic violence and abuse. So if anyone's interested when that book's released, we can let you know. It's a fairly unresearched and unwritten about area of practice, I think. Just for a start, I'll just take you through what we're going to do in the next hour and a half. We'll just have some initial reflections about professional buttons and responses. Just to, I mean, it's probably something that you're very familiar with doing, but I think it'll just get a gauge of where we're at in the room, so to speak, with this topic. Claire will talk us through the research, and then we'll look at Brian and Colin's narratives and just keep pausing for some discussion and feedback from the group about what Brian and Colin say. We'll use their words because I think it's quite powerful, I think, to let their words from the research speak to you, and you can then look at and think about their patterns of abuse and their patterns of behaviour.
Can I just mention something there, Margaret? I'm sure. We'll mention this anyway, but Brian and Colin are nobody's real names, by the way. We'll come on to that when we talk about the cases.
And then we'll just summarise by something around talking to engaging violent men and the importance of locating the central dynamics of domestic abuse and including the perpetrator perspective, pattern and behaviour within that. So I hope that's okay. Comment as we go along. Janine will keep a check on the comments. If there's anything that's burning as we go along, please feel free to stick a hand up or put a comment. And it's online, which is kind of a strange situation. I'm not sure I've ever quite got used to teaching online, really, because I do like to see people's faces, but at least we can see comments and we can see hands up and we can get some engagement going, so it will enrich the session for you that way. Right, so just in the chat now, if you can just put in how you view perpetrators, just do a go-to, a gut feeling when you get a case that involves an older perpetrator. What's your sort of gut feeling and gut responses? I'm going to try and look at. I can look at the chat when I do this, or just shout something out if you want to.
Okay.
So yeah, so it's a history of abuse, not a one-off. Maggie, yeah. There may also be a victim. High risk, aggressive people. We're just asking for real, honest gut feelings here. Yeah. What's the background? Mixed feelings. Overcompensate with the service I provide. That's really honest, Victoria. Thank you for that. Scared, Georgia. Thank you. Childhood issues, safety planning. Sean, yeah. Illness, dementia. Okay, good. May have fallen through the cracks of healthcare services and support, yeah. Look at the history. It is never as simple as it looks. I think the more I work with perpetrators and the more I listen to them speak, the more I understand how nuanced and intricate working with perpetrators is, and how intricate their speech is actually, and how important listening is when working with them as well. That's something we've been talking about in my other role recently.
Zoe, that's really interesting. The adverse childhood experiences, whatever they may be. Yeah.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. So can I just share some thoughts that I've had over the years? I don't know what you think about this, and again, please feel free to comment. One of the things that I always think about is what's happening when I'm working with a perpetrator. What's my process? Because that can influence the outcome. So I'm not saying that any of you do this. I'm just self-reflecting in terms of over the years, what might have happened in my practice. So I'm going to own this. So do we other them? Do we fear them, disapprove of them, feel that we must challenge, feel that we have to be the voice or advocate of the harmed person, or feel sorry for them? I think I've probably been in all of those places over the years. I don't know about you, Claire.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Whatever we think and feel, does this leak out into our approach? And that's something I'm always mindful of as well. And it's something that we often discuss in treatment management when we're looking at the group work sessions. Is something leaking out here that might be happening for the facilitator? As a result, of anything leaking out, or those sort of preconceptions we have, we're more likely to be a number of things, possibly more punitive, possibly more confrontational, possibly less tolerant, possibly less compassionate than we are with other people. Or conversely, might we be more avoidant because of that sense of fear when they come with quite a powerful narrative? Are we less likely to take a relational approach and hear their story, perhaps because our focus is on the victim's story and safeguarding? Does this influence how we perceive and use professional status and power in this type of work? And I certainly think that's a long journey that I've taken in perpetrator work over the years, where to position myself in terms of professional identity, status and power when I'm working with perpetrators. Any comments on that before we move forward? Let me just go back a slide there if I can. Does anybody want to say anything about that? Claire, do you want to comment?
Yeah, I was just thinking about, I was just making a few notes, Margaret, and I was thinking about my research process, which I know I'm going to talk about in a second, but also if I think about my experience of working with perpetrators, as I said to you before, in the criminal justice context, really. Sometimes it was more difficult with some perpetrators to find empathy for me I'm going to be honest, I'm just saying it how it is, really, to find an empathic response. And what I did really notice, and I know this comes through in a lot of training that we've done around working with people who have behaviours that are not nice, that unconditional positive regard for the person, not for what they've done, is sometimes a bit of a drag, and quite difficult to drag up. But for me, that paid dividends. And just in the research, I mean, I wasn't even, the men I'm going to talk to you about in a minute, I wasn't even working with these men in a social work way, do you know what I mean, or a probation way. It was research, it was objective, asking them about their stories of becoming perpetrators. And I found myself really struggling not to challenge some of the things that they said. And you'll see when we tell you some of the things that they said, you can perhaps imagine sitting there that you might have I wanted to challenge some of those things. So it's not easy, and it pushes buttons.
It does push buttons, and I think it's different with different perpetrators. And it can also be different with different perpetrators on different days. I'm sure you all probably know this, but it's kind of useful, I think, to share experiences, because one of the things I definitely think with this kind of work is that peer support is really, really important. And that sort of in-depth critical reflection on practice, on how you're being impacted and how you're looking after yourself in this kind of work is really crucial.
Absolutely.
Should we move on?
Yeah.
Janine, is there anything in the chat? Just a quick check.
I mean, I'm just going to, Gemma, thank you for that comment. Gemma says, I love the honesty, really feel it's important to recognise how we feel, and I would really go with that. I think it is.
Yeah, it is. It really important. I mean, I said this in the session on Monday, and I'll say it again today. Somebody once said to me, Margaret, in this work, nothing is normal. And that was really freeing for me, because there's all kinds of stuff I've been holding about perpetrator work. And I was thinking, I can't say that out loud. They'll think I'm terrible. I can't say that out loud. They'll think I'm not good at my job. But actually, when that person said that to me, who was a treatment manager that I was working with in a particular programme, it really freed me up to be able to say, well, I'm feeling like this and I'm worried about that. And I'm really struggling with this particular individual because, and that was really empowering, I think, on a practical level.
I think it's something about your own well-being and resilience that we have to acknowledge. Yeah.
Okay, over to you, Claire.
Rightio, thank you. Okay, so back in, when was it now? Let me have a think.
2016, was it?
Was it 16? Back in 2016, so I was doing this this master's programme that involved a piece of research, and what I really wanted to research was something around domestic abuse, but because I was really interested and had worked, quite a bit with perpetrators, I used to chair MARAC actually in Manchester City, so I'd really got that interest, and I always felt that at that point anyway, from the MARAC process, I don't know about the up-to-date picture, but the perspective of the perpetrator never seemed to really feature very strongly, and the perpetrator was kind of left out of the picture a little bit, I suppose. So I felt really strongly that I wanted to understand from the perpetrators themselves about their lived experience of becoming and being a perpetrator. That was the simplest way I could think to sum it up, and I decided to do what we call a biographical narrative study. Do you want to go to the next slide, Margaret, please? Okay, so this was an overview of the study. So I see that somebody else is studying at Salford University. I spotted that in the chat. So I was studying at Salford University, and I gained ethical clearance for the piece of research because obviously I was going to be speaking to men directly about their experiences of being perpetrators. So I got that ethical clearance, and then I was really fortunate to make contact with a local organisation, a voluntary organisation, who could identify a number of men who would be willing to speak to me about this experience. And I ended up interviewing lengthy interviews with 5 men. You don't need to know the ins and outs of this, but I followed something called BNIM, Biographical Narrative Interpretive Method, Wengraf 2001. Margaret actually introduced me to it, and it was a great process for speaking to these men and getting their stories, which is what I wanted. So they were all perpetrators of domestic abuse. There were 5 of them. Some of them were younger, some of them were older. And all of those men had been through the same treatment programme. It wasn't criminal justice mandated, so it wasn't, you know, a court mandated programme. And they were eligible to or were attending a follow-up support programme as well. So they were sort of treated, in inverted commas, and they were keen to be involved and tell their stories, which was great for me. They'd all been violent to their female partner, sometimes singular, sometimes plural. 4 out of 5 of the men interviewed had self-referred themselves into the treatment programme, and 1 out of those 5 had been directed to attend that programme by the family court, okay? And at that point, 2 of them were aged over 60, and they were the case studies that we then went on to develop for the book chapter that Margaret mentioned, and also the case studies that we'll use for this session. Okay, so a brief note on biographical narrative interpretive method. What it is a face-to-face open narrative interview process. It begins with a single framing question, which is called a SQUIN, a single question to induce narrative. And basically it involves saying to them, this is what I want to understand, and I want you to tell me your story, and you can start where you want and you can end where you want. This is not my story, this is yours. So then the participants began, constructed and ended the narrative on their own terms, and that was so that their authentic voice could flow, really. Some of these interviews were up to 3 hours long. They were recorded, we had to take breaks, they all had to be transcribed, but the data was extremely rich as a result. And I'm just going to mention one thing there. We talked just before I started to talk about the research about the importance of looking after ourselves, well-being and resilience. And I can say to you that some of these, and I'm going to be very honest because we've said that that's a good thing, some of these interviews took a very large personal toll on me. One of them in particular, we're not going to focus on in this session, but it was to do with the timing of the interview. And I think it's really important, you know, I bet other people have had similar experiences. I interviewed one of these men between 6 and 9 p.m. on a Friday night. I know, crazy, don't ask me why I did that. The organisation was open, they had a room available, he was available because he wasn't working, and I met him there and he told me some horrific stuff. And I came away on a December night at 9 o'clock in the rain to go back home, and I thought, am I crazy, or what am I doing this for? You know, I was left really quite distressed, if I'm honest, by that. So I think that was a lesson to me about our own looking after ourselves and our resilience and well-being, and not, you know, really thinking about when we speak to people and what we're speaking to them about. Yeah. So anyway, the 5 men took part in this process, and they constructed and gave their own narratives. Everybody was asked to tell their story as they saw fit. There were no real questions. They could decide where to stop and start. And the focus was on their, as it says there, their journey to becoming, the pathway to becoming, and then being and continuing to be, in some cases, a perpetrator of domestic abuse. And there were some themes that emerged, okay? So one of the themes was around gender. Well, you won't be surprised to hear that, I suppose. But in particular, notions around masculinity and maleness, hegemonic masculinity, power, and ideas and sort of thoughts around entitlement, okay? Attitudes relating to the use of violence, both within and external to intimate relationships. So you know, some of the men were violent in relationships, but they were also generally violent as teenagers, violent in their workplace settings. Some are, you know, violent in their social life, in getting into street fights and this kind of thing. And there were some factors such as age and generation that came to play in relation to attitudes as well. We identified some what are called critical junctures in the life course, and I suppose perhaps another term for critical juncture might be a turning point. Some people talked about a eureka moment, something that the light bulb went on, you know, that might have triggered, therefore, attempts for them to want to change, want to desist, and want to move away from the kind of lives that they've been living with, violence being part of that. And then there was something as well around maturing and completion of treatment programmes in relation to the use of violence and future risks and efforts towards, should that say desistance, Margaret?
Oh, it should say desistance.
Yes,
Sorry
okay.
about that.
No, it's fine. And efforts towards desistance. So I'm sure we're going to mention this in a minute, but what I heard from all 5 men, and I appreciate it's a small study, you know, it's not a massive large scale study that we can say, you know, we could extrapolate the results to the general population, but what all of these men were saying is that we're not the finished product, we're not a completed piece of work. You know, this kind of effort towards desistance must continue into the future. So they were really the 4 themes that came out. There were other things as well, but you know, in the main, they were the themes, Margaret, I think.
Yeah, can we just get a gauge in the chat of who's familiar with the notion of desistance in relation to offending? When we get to that bit with their narratives, we might need to say a little bit more about that, perhaps. Okay. I'll move on for now. If you could just let us know in the chat, and Gillian, if you could take a note of that would be brilliant.
Okay. So desistance. Okay, yeah.
Okay. So we've got the case studies of Brian and Colin. Claire, do you want to carry on until we get through the case studies, maybe?
Yes, I will do. Yeah, okay then. So we can talk about what desistance is. It's a simple concept, which just means moving away from offending. It might mean a bit more than that as well, but we can talk about that. So I had these 5 men that I interviewed, and because we're talking about older perpetrators, we took as a definition, I think we used the government definition of the age of 65 denoting older age, didn't we, Margaret? I can't remember.
Yeah, we did. We went for that, yeah.
Yeah, so we sort of decided anybody over the age of 65 or over would fall into this group of like older perpetrators. The other 3 were all younger men, one in the 30s, one who was 50, and I'm trying to think the other one was about 42 at the time, so a few years on from there now. You know, they said lots of interesting things as well, but we wanted to focus on the older perpetrators. We have changed the names to Brian and Colin for anonymity purposes, and they're the case studies that we thought we would draw out and analyse their narratives then in the context of the point in time at which they were telling me their stories and reflecting on their behaviour. And what Margaret and I have done is we've pulled out some of the quotations, some of their words, to illustrate some of the themes that I mentioned to you on the previous slide, okay? And I suppose it's thinking about what they're saying, the things that they're saying, what that means for our safeguarding work, because that's what we're all in the business to do, and the practice issues related to both Brian and Colin in social work practice.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so Brian, as I say, not his real name, a white British man who would, at the time of interview, was in his mid-60s. He had been married to Sandra, again, not Sandra's real name, not his wife's real name, for over 30 years, and they got 2 grown-up children, okay? Brian's use of violence had extended throughout his life, from being a teenager through to his mid-60s, and involved both generalised and also intimate partner violence. So there was that kind of range of violence that I mentioned before. Brian had spent a number of years in his adult life in the military, but he was unemployed at the time of interview, okay? And Colin, a white British man as well, was in his 70s at the time of interview. He'd been married to Sheila for over 50 years, and they had 2 grown-up children. Colin had worked as an engineer, but at the point when I interviewed him, he was retired by that time. and Colin had been violent and abusive to Sheila for many years throughout their marriage, and he talked to me in a lot of detail about that relationship and the violence. And Colin alluded to the potential for using violence outside of his marriage on one occasion, but his narrative largely focused on the violence to Sheila specifically.
Okay, so shall we look at the first part of the theme then? What I'll do is, what I've done, or what we've done, is we've separated some of the words from Brian and some of the words from Colin. I wonder if it'd be helpful if we just read through these and then leave it for people to put a hand up on mic, put some comments in the chat about what you think that might mean for you as a practitioner. If they said those things to you, what would that tell you about safeguarding needs, I do beg your pardon, and what would that tell you about risk? So this is in relation to the first theme, which is gender and those notions of masculinity, power and entitlement, and they particularly turn to the issue of Brian and Colin's self-image and what being a man and masculinity means to them. So some of the things that Brian spoke about was playing the tough guy. He spoke about being the man, and he meant that in relation to situations where he felt upset or he felt in danger or he perceived there might be danger to other people. He felt he had to be the man. He always felt that he had to be strong and be the winner. He spoke about his school days and being that term cock of the school, which I imagine you've all heard of, the best fighter in the school, the person most likely to win. And he referred to that as being a macho thing. So there was a real clear stream through his narrative about what being a man and masculinity meant and what sort of self-image that generated for him. So Colin spoke about not wanting to stand back, and he meant if he saw an altercation or a fight or a dispute, he felt he had to sort of not stand back. He felt that he should get involved. He talked about going to the pub with the lads and that being a culture that he was in, and he referred to it as male culture. And there was a whole issue for Colin, wasn't there, about identity and status through work. And that was sort of intrinsically linked with masculinity, because it was a very male working environment, and it was about the company men that he worked with, and it was all very male in his narrative. There was no sort of femininity around that at all. It was all very, very male. He did say at one point, I wonder what they would think if they knew, and he meant that in relation to domestic abuse, because there was a group of people that he was keen to impress and keen to be a part of, and it was kind of in his mind to think, I wonder what they would think if they saw me differently, if they knew about the domestic abuse, which I suppose gives some indication that he has some sense of awareness of his domestic abuse and that wasn't okay, even within those very male environments. So can we just take a moment perhaps to reflect on that? What do you think about that? What do those notions of self-image and masculinity, and we could call it toxic masculinity, I suppose, couldn't we, for Brian and Colin? It very much was. What would those things suggest to you about risk, about safeguarding, about how you might engage and work with Brian and Colin should they come onto your caseload?
I mean, while people are thinking, I'll just say, in addition to the Brian, Margaret, he did talk about playing the tough guy, and I had to be strong and be the winner. And one of the things I said to him was, well, what would it mean if you weren't? And it was weakness. That would be seen as weakness.
Yes,
and he couldn't be seen as weak. Yeah. So to not win, whatever that means, in any sense of the violence that we're talking about, he had to, he couldn't be seen as weak.
Yeah. Okay, so learned behaviour from their older male relatives, Pamela. Yeah, and I think one of the things we spoke about in the book chapter, wasn't it, Claire, was about the ecological model, actually, the nested ecological model, and how their behaviour seems to really sit within that. And there are lots of theories around domestic violence and abuse, but actually the words of these men really sat within that nested ecological model and that sort of societal collusion and male cultural collusion that they either sought out or naturally had, which meant that their behaviour for many, many years went unchecked and unchallenged, and in fact went reinforced. Learned behaviours. Yeah, I think that's right, Georgia. I also think that, as well as it being learned, it's about perhaps there's some sense of reassurance, I think, for them in the circles that they choose to mix with, that they can sit in those circles and believe actually this is okay, this is normal, this is not wrong. So there's something about them seeking reinforcement around their social circles as well.
Pamela Phillips, that's a really interesting idea. As a female, you feel it's not okay, or sorry, not safe to challenge. Yeah. And, you know, I don't mind saying I sat in a room with some of these men and didn't feel entirely comfortable all of the time with all of them. And that was just as a researcher. I wasn't challenging anything. I wasn't trying to, you know, get anybody to change their behaviour particularly. But yes, it's hard.
So lots of really good comments here about. Let's come back to the issue of challenging, because I have to say what Brian and Colin say I hear on a weekly basis in group. It's there, and we've even heard people say things like, "As women, you're bound to side with." And it can be difficult to challenge, but I think sometimes my default position is often to just sit back and say, let me understand more about what you're saying. And within the narrative, what I'm looking for is a safer place to challenge, or a starting place to challenge. And I think what we need to think about is, what are we challenging for? Which bits do we need to challenge particularly? And how might we do that? And we can come on to that as well. So yeah, there's all sorts of things here. Social norms, men as the breadwinners. I think there's something very generational, Zoe, as well about that. For them, it was really generational, and for some of the men that I've heard in the programs I've worked with, I think it's generational and cultural for them as well. And I mean all cultures, actually, across cultures, that they've sort of got this notion of themselves as what maleness is. One of the exercises we've always done is the man in the box, and what being a man means to them, and what would it mean to step outside of that box. They try avoid indicating perceived weakness or approach as to try and counter this, without them becoming defensive, James. Yeah, that's absolutely right. Yeah. Some of them deep inside, they do worry about how society perceives them. They're not as tough as they may intend to be perceived. I think that's right. And I don't know what you think about this, Claire, but I think there's two ways I see it, really. I often see this behaviour as sort of a boiled egg with nothing in it, you know, just the shell. So if you tap that boiled egg shell, it's got nothing hard behind it to protect that tap on it. And your finger will just go right through. So it's actually very fragile underneath.
Well, I was just going to say, with talking to Brian, my enduring feeling from him was, from the experience of interviewing him, was that it must have been fairly exhausting to keep this front up, because he couldn't not be the tough guy. And you know, God, how difficult must that be all the time? But yeah, and it was difficult, because he did talk about some of the relationships within his family that suffered as a result. He's one of his kids, for a start. But I sensed it was quite tiring and exhausting for him, really.
And I think one of the things that I often find with men who present like that is that for the majority, I can't say for all of them, but for the majority, underneath that presentation and the need to maintain that presentation is a sense of awareness that this is not okay. So we need to recognise and deal with shame in that respect, and it's how we work with their shame or their sense of awareness that this is not okay. So I've often found questions like, what would it mean for you to be weak? What would it mean for you if? How would it feel to you if? I wonder how you perceive this behaviour yourself in other people. Who do you tell about this? Who don't you tell? All those questions can get us to the root of that sort of shame and sense of consciousness that for them that this is not okay. And that can kind of open up a conversation without us going directly in and saying, look, that's not okay, you can't talk like that. And I'm not saying you would, I'm just sort of caricaturing what a harsh challenge might look like and what another kind of challenge might involve. I don't know what you think about that. Please feel free to tell me if I'm making sense here.
I think a really important point for me is especially what Colin said, albeit the characteristics, sorry, I can't get my words out, around the masculinity, but again, the acknowledgement of what other people think of him.
Yeah. Oh, that was so important, Colin. I mean, as Margaret said, he had this group of all male working in, I'm just going to say, a very male industry, okay? You know what I mean by that. It was a male-dominated industrial setting where he worked, machinery and things, and he had responsibility for unlocking, and he had to be there at 7 every morning, because what would people think? You know, he was responsible. He had to be the sort of the big I am, really, in many ways, in the company, you know, to be there, be reliable, be dependable. And then he used to say, and then I think, if they knew, what would they think? Because that would really, you know, drop his status, he thought, you know, in their eyes, if they knew that he was a perpetrator of domestic abuse.
I think that is a really good point, Jane, and I have to say I don't know the answer to your question. Is the bottom line. But what I think I would say about men who have long established patterns of abuse and coercive control is that something about those patterns plays out wherever they are. I've seen it towards me when I've worked in the prison, when I've worked in treatment programs, wherever I've worked, I've kind of had a sense of that controlling nature that they have, you know, that needs to control. Whether it comes across in the way they speak to me, in the way they might feel entitled towards me, in the comments they might make towards me. I've always found that somewhere that there's evidence of their behaviours that is offence relevant, but perhaps not an offence as in the way that a domestic abuse offence is, if you know what I mean. So that what I'm saying, I think, in a fairly clumsy way perhaps, is that their patterns of domestic violence and abuse and their patterns of coercive control play out, in my experience, and I can only talk from my experience because I genuinely don't know the answer to your question, Jane, they play out in other areas of their lives. So it plays out in how they respond to social workers, to police officers, to care workers, to other people.
Jane, what I would say as well in response to that is domestic abuse perpetrators, it's, you know, it is an under-researched area, and we would always be up for joining up with people, wouldn't we, Margaret, to do some research into specific areas like that. So
that's really important, actually.
So Jane, if that's something you're interested in, get in touch, Jane, and we can have a look, you know, what we could do. It's really important, actually.
Should we move on? Because I'm just a little bit mindful of time.
Yeah.
Let me just close that down and go on to the next slide. So the next slide then is again on the issue of gender and masculinity, but this is the sort of comments they made about women. And I've particularly picked out here, or we've particularly picked out here. Sorry, I keep saying I shouldn't say that, Claire. I don't mean to.
I forgive you.
Thank you very much. Their comments about what happens after arguments and what happens around domestic abuse. So Brian said that after an argument, I obviously did not leave the house. And that word obviously is in italics for a reason, because he thought that was obvious. He shouldn't have to leave. And he spoke about his daughter challenging him at one point, and his response was to say to his daughter, "Don't you dare speak to me like that." And that again came across as, look, I'm the boss of this house. You're my daughter. You don't have a right to speak to me like that. And what he said was that if somebody shouts at me in the house, I'm just going to outshout them.
It would just shout louder.
Just shout louder. Just outshout. Yeah. So for Colin, he spoke about any conflicts with Sheila being discussed when I am ready. And he mentioned that Sheila said to him about that she thought that meant I talk, you listen, i.e. he talks, she listens, and that you can say what you like, but I can't. And I thought this was really interesting, Claire, wasn't it, that Colin said? He said, one thing I did say to Sheila at the height of all this is that we're better together than two singles. You know, I've always thought that even during the real dire days, they should be together and that they were better off together. And that was his perception, and that was what he told Sheila. I wonder what you think about that.
I would like to have known what Sheila thought, to be honest. But
I would have liked to have known what Sheila thought. But I think it's interesting that in his narrative, there was no notion of what Sheila thought about that, or what Sheila might think about that. That was kind of Brian's narrative was, if this happens, I'm obviously not going to leave. And Colin's narrative was, look, if there's a conflict, it's dealt with when I'm ready. Sheila clearly had a different perception on that. But there's this sense of entitlement to say to her, look, whatever's happening, Sheila, we're better off together than being single. Any thoughts on those comments, guys?
Controlling, yeah.
It is definitely control. And it's about controlling not only the argument, but how the argument ends. And I think that that's really important, actually. Something to talk to people about in practice, I think, is how an argument ends. Because I think it's not just about their behaviour in the heat of the moment, which is violent and abusive. It's all those coercive and controlling behaviours that go around that.
And you'll see some more of those in the story shortly. Yeah.
So it says when an argument starts, who determines that, how an argument progresses, where abuse occurs, how an argument ends, what happens after an argument. I think in terms of understanding perpetrator patterns, it's important to understand that whole range of behaviours, not just that microcosm of an abusive incident, because there's a whole heap of stuff that goes around that.
Victoria Marden, that's really interesting. If they separated, he might have to explain to others. So yeah, by saying him saying to Sheila, we're better together than not together, you know, he was trying to avoid that separation, really. Yeah.
I think there's an awful lot of really good comments. It's really hard to get through them, actually. But I just think you're absolutely bang on. And I think there's something about sitting with the uncomfortable information with violent men, that listening to this stuff is not comfortable. And it kind of when I read it out, I think, oh, you know, this is really not nice stuff to listen to.
No, it's not.
But I think it's important to hear, because it talks to us about their patterns, and actually it tells us a lot about where they're coming from. And if we're hearing that and we're thinking, okay, this is indicating that there's a whole lot of very entrenched stuff from this man. So actually to get to a point of safety is going to be quite a journey. And I think it's sometimes about evidencing that and understanding that, and then thinking, what does that mean for immediacy, for imminent safety, as well as sort of long-term safety? Because that idea of imminency is really important. If all this stuff, the attitudes, the beliefs, the behaviours are around that fuel the violent incidents, then it talks to the issue of imminency and continuation of abuse. Yeah,
that's important, Amanda, that fear that the partner might be thinking about leaving.
Yeah,
that ties in really nicely with the stuff that we or fear, absolutely, Georgia, fear of police involvement. Yeah.
And of course we know, don't we, that leaving is a really risky time in domestic violence and abuse. And I think if we get that notion that their partner may be thinking of leaving, even through their words, then I think if that's your gut feeling, you have to go with that gut and investigate it and explore it and be curious around it and think, okay, what can we do with this? How can we support her if she really is thinking of leaving? How can we find that out in a safe way away from him? And how might we sort of plan towards safe leaving? Because just upping and going is often not an option for people. Sometimes perversely staying is, in their mind, often a safer option, particularly if they've been told they're going to be killed if they do leave. There's lots of really, really good comments. That fear of losing control of the situation. If people want control and they're frightened of losing control, that can be a really risky moment. It's a really important time for safeguarding when we need to. I know somebody's on the call who's an IDVA. But that's obviously when we need to be working closely with that multi-agency network, thinking about MARAC, thinking about women's support services and victim survivor support services, thinking about disruptive measures for perpetrators, thinking about how we can safety plan with both parties in a multi-agency way. Should we move on? Right, okay. Ooh. So we're going to move on to attitudes to violence. Claire, do you want me to read through these? Are you all right with that?
Yes, of course. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm just going to read through what Brian and Colin say and let you take that in and think about it, and then we'll come back and try and have another chat. If anybody wants to unmic and make a comment, then please do. That'd be really nice to hear some voices. So Brian talks about, I can't go into a lot of detail because my memory is not that good nowadays. And initially, when he spoke about the perpetrator programme, Claire, he said that he didn't perceive himself to have, and it's a quote, any real issues, didn't he?
He did, yeah.
And he spoke about his alcohol use and violence, and he kind of acknowledged that became a problem then as I got older. I was probably more short-tempered. and that was specifically in relation to his use of alcohol and the association that that might have with his violent behaviour. He certainly had a sense of violence as being normal within his social circles, and he referred to his violent behaviour as the mist comes down, it's kind of like a blank. And interestingly, he spoke about the facilitator of the Perpetrator programme not liking that kind of explanation of violence and not accepting that kind of explanation of violence. So he had a notion that that was not okay. He'd been told it was not okay, but he was still saying it's like the mist's come down and it's kind of like blank. A lot of men have said that to me, actually. The red mist I've heard quite a lot, Claire. I'm sure you have.
Sorry, I was just replying to something.
Okay.
In the chat.
Okay. So Colin talks about, I can't guarantee, it's a long time ago, it doesn't happen every week or every month or and then he says, I'm guessing, I'm really guessing. And he talks in very vague terms about things and we, which kind of mutualizes the violence. It sets it into the context of situational or bidirectional violence when he uses terms like we. And I think in somebody's language, it's important to listen for those nuances of words that they use. He doesn't name violence as abuse. He often talks about things, and that's something we come across a lot, and I'm sure you do as well. There were some contradictions in what he said, though. Although he says, I can't really remember on occasions, and he uses the same sort of mists of time analogy that Brian uses. He and Brian are actually extremely lucid and extremely clear on some issues. So at one point, Colin can talk about knocking the hell out of her in very clear and very concrete terms. And on the other hand, he talks about things being lost in the mists of time. He describes himself as being henpecked and downtrodden and verbally inadequate. And in relation to his violence, he refers to Sheila sticking her finger in the hornet's nest. So
what does that serve to do? Any ideas? Yeah, absolutely, Victoria, passing the blame. Yeah. So it's your fault. If you will stick your finger in the hornet's nest, what do you expect the result to be? You're going to get stung. That was more or less, what he was saying, actually. And what was interesting, it's not in these quotes, I know, but Colin had a son who was about 50 at this point, and his son would also say to his mum, you shouldn't go sticking your finger in the hornet's nest. In other words, we all know what he's like. If you carry on, this is what's going to happen. So, it wasn't just him passing the blame. It was other family members as well that were grown up. It's like, wow, they were providing an excuse for his behaviour. Absolutely, Victoria. Yeah. Thanks, Margaret.
It's kind of like a lot of men who I've heard say that the partner pushes their buttons. So it kind of neutralises their responsibility, and it does externalise to a very large extent as well. And I think those are the phrases that we need to think about.
Yeah, Victoria, that's a really interesting comment. I'm confused why Colin volunteered for the programme when he clearly doesn't accept full responsibility. Yeah, it was Victoria. Yeah, but not uncommon at all, whether it's a mandated programme where men are told to attend. I think accepting full responsibility is a rarity, Margaret, rather than something that we see regularly. And Colin actually had tried to seek out some sort of, I won't say treatment, but support for his behaviour much earlier in his life when he was a younger man. I think we talk about that in a minute, do we, Margaret?
Yeah, we do. Yeah.
Which was unsuccessful. You'll see why in a second. And then he came back to this programme because he was at a critical juncture where he was in trouble with the police, basically, and the police had got involved, and he was frightened, and he went to this programme. So you question then how much of it is about him wanting to actually change his behaviour, or to be seen to be doing the right thing. And if changing behaviour comes out of that, then great. So yeah,
that's what I was just wondering. Like, is it because he was forced? Well, any of them, is it because they felt forced, or perhaps their relationship was at threat of ending? Is that their way of sort of just saying, I am doing something, I'm trying my best? But I don't know. I obviously don't know the full background of these gentlemen, but
it's interesting, Victoria. I mean, if I think back to the 5 men as a group, and I know we're focusing on Brian and Colin, and it was only 5, it wasn't 500, so I can't claim representation, but if I think back to the 5 men, for each of them, one of them was told to attend the programme by the family court. In other words, you know, you do this or you don't have contact with your children. So it was a condition. It was a, you know, something he had to do. The other 4 all turned up at the programme, self-referred by making the contact with the organisation and asking to join the programme and paying to do it actually as well. Because something had happened that must have been a bit of a shock to them. So something had pulled them up sharp, if you will. You know, either the police were involved all of a sudden and they were risking prosecution or, you know, maybe imprisonment or being locked up. They were also risking losing their partners potentially. Some of them were also had risked killing a partner and were like, my God, I've come that close to actually really seriously doing something this time. Something's got to change. So it was those reasons that propelled people towards a treatment program, it seemed. Yeah. Absolutely, Ellen.
The programs I've worked on, Ellen, we've had I mean the same child protection referrals, CAFCAS referrals, not in Manchester actually, outside of Manchester, and sometimes you can see that somebody doesn't want to be there particularly, but actually sometimes when you work with them they do, and I'm sure you'll have found that, Ellen. I think the one, before we move on, if I can just say one thing about this sort of dichotomy of what Colin says, where sometimes he's very lucid and sometimes he talks about the risk, the mists of time. We could see that in terms of what Bill Miller would call ambivalence, which is he sees as a natural human state, that people naturally can see reasons for change and can see reasons for maintaining the status quo. So some of that is what motivational interviewing would call sustained talk in favour of staying the same, and some of it is what motivational interviewing would call change talk in favour of change. And I think one of the biggest lessons I've learned from motivational interviewing training is about listening for change and sustained talk, and thinking about things in terms of ambivalence has been really helpful, because actually if that's a natural human state, what we need to do is help people to express and resolve their ambivalence, and that's something that I've found really useful.
I wonder as well, Margaret, Janine, I know you've got your hand up. Are you okay if I say one very brief thing? I wonder if this is a good point to just say, I'll read out a definition of desistance. Desistance is a criminological term. So Margaret and myself have been familiar with it through our work in the criminal justice system, but it is an interesting concept because it's about the process of change, which we're all in the business of, you know, encouraging people to think about change in one way or another, I suppose. So desistance is the process of abstaining from crime by those with a previous pattern of offending. It is an ongoing process and often involves some false stops and starts. And actually, you know, if you think about a process of change, Prochaska and Di Clemente wrote about the cycle of change. You know, even if you stop smoking, well, I used to be a smoker. For me to stop smoking, I went round the cycle, I don't know how many times, in order to actually one day become a non-smoker. And I think the ideas around desistance are similar. And then if we throw into the mix the concept of getting older, what it says is that aging out is seen by desistance theorists as one reason that humans cease committing crimes. Not always. So with Colin and Brian, we see the criminal, you know, the violent behaviour, potentially criminal, continuing. But desistance is that ceasing of criminal behaviour. It's a criminological term, just going back to the stuff we said really early on. Is that okay? Okay. Janine, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on where Brian talks about my memory's not that good. And when we're dealing with older people, memory obviously deteriorates over time. So many people that are on the session today will work with older people, and memory deficits will be a feature of the work that they're doing with them. But I just wonder, it just feels like when you were saying that both were very lucid in your discussions and interviews with them, do you think that could be an excuse because of their age, that they can use that to say, oh, I can't really remember what went on, or it was such a long time ago, I can't guarantee. And could that be something that they're relating? Because would a younger perpetrator use that statement?
That's or would say that? Yeah. Well, with Brian and Colin, I suppose that it was the juxtaposition between, I can't really say because my memory's not that good nowadays, but then would recall distant and very recent. So, you know, there didn't seem to be a distinction. Events with absolute clarity, including what was said in a particular scenario. So I wondered whether it was a distancing technique. Actually, I wondered whether it was something to keep the story at arm's length a little bit. It's something I'm really familiar with. I don't know about you, Margaret, in assessing people in the criminal justice system, that where they don't. We used to work with a lot of people convicted of sexual offences in the prison, which are really difficult to talk about. We know that, and often memory, I know I can't really remember, and I don't really know, would be used as a technique to keep you at arm's length because they didn't want to get into talking about really difficult things. So it could be that was my sense, I suppose.
I've come across it a lot, that notion of red mist and that notion of I can't really remember. And we've always spoken, haven't we, about the importance of how we conceptualize that. Because I think if I go back to my early days of practice in this field, words like denial and minimisation were very big and very loud. And actually, they weren't very helpful, I don't think, to my practice at that stage, if I look back honestly on practice at that stage, because I think it gave me a degree of power that I didn't have. And I probably used that power to confront and challenge in ways that weren't helpful. But I think with training over the years and with much more sort of support and supervision and all the things that go along with that, I've kind of come to think about that slightly differently and think about how we can conceptualise denial and minimisation differently without ignoring risk and without avoiding safeguarding. But I think it sometimes helps me, and I don't know about other people, to think about what's underneath that, to think about things like ambivalence, to think about things like shame, to think about things like guilt. And we talk about shame in the programmes. I'm guessing you do as well, Ellen, in your programme. But it's about connecting with something in the men that allows a degree of empathy for their experience. I don't like admitting when I'm wrong. They're just telling you what I told you then feels embarrassing, and I'm worried now about what people think and whether people will judge me for having admitted to being, you know, quite a aggressive almost practitioner if it came across that way. It's worrying. So I think for any of us, you know, admitting when you're not quite proud of your behaviour is not an easy process to go through. And I think that allows me to engage with in a more empathic way with perpetrators and think about how we might talk to and engage with them slightly differently to get that information that's important, either to support them towards behaviour change and to safeguard.
There's interesting about the alcohol, Nicola, actually. Interesting about alcohol, because a lot of Brian's behaviour of the violent sort was when he'd had a few drinks, you know, whether it was in the street, if you will, when he was a younger man, or within the family. Mm-hmm.
I'm just going to say, well, I'm just really mindful of time because the chat is so rich. But I just want to quickly mention something else that I found really helpful from motivational interviewing training, actually, and that's this notion of psychological reactance. That when people come to us and they've done something like perpetrate domestic violence and abuse, what Bill Miller says is that they come to us with the natural sense that they're going to get judged and admonished, and they expect some kind of challenge. So they prepare for that and they defend against that when they come in to see us. And he says that's a natural psychological process. And if we hit that with harsh challenge, what might happen is that they will then think, oh, they're attacking me, so I'm going to defend my narrative. I'm going to defend my position. And that makes their position bigger and almost sound worse than it is. So I think that notion of psychological reactance and how we even start those conversations and how we prefix those conversations with some reassurances about things like separating the person and the behaviour, and a sense of this is not about judgment, this is about understanding, can just head off some of that stuff at the pass, really, in my experience. Mm-hmm. Not all the time, but sometimes. I think we need to move on.
Okay.
This is such a rich conversation, guys. Moving on. Right, okay. So a little bit more from Colin about attitudes to violence. Maybe we'll just take a couple of comments on this and then move on. So So one time when she was really having a go at me, I did get a bowl full of water and I virtually stood her in a corner and just ladled cupfuls at her until she stood there like a drowned rat.
Can I just say that was really hard to listen to him saying that. Yeah. I hated him in that moment, and I did. And he talked about, which is not in that quote, he talked about having his hand on her chest there. So he was holding her into the corner and throwing water into her face, basically. How, I'm not quite sure, you know, ladled cupfuls, that kind of makes it sound less than it is. And he talked about having he said at that point, you know, I wonder whether her dad was whether his wife's dad was violent to his wife's mum, because her mum had said to him, if she ever gets on her high horse, this is what you need to do. That's what he said, which I don't actually believe. I mean, it's possible, I suppose, but you know, what I was receiving was his story, but he wanted to put over this perception that her mother-in-law had said that would be his mother-in-law had said it would be a good thing for his wife if he did that. Do you see?
And if I just want to respond to what you said about hating him in that moment, Claire, because I think that's understandable, and I think that's about self-awareness in practice, isn't it? And I think that's really important, that we're able to say, oh, this feels really hard to say as a practitioner who's working within SWE professional standards, but actually
it was very hard.
I felt repulsed. I found that really difficult. And unless we're aware of that in ourselves, we can't internally reflect on practice, and we can't manage it. And then it starts to leak. So I think acknowledging those hard things about how it impacts on us is really, really important in terms of managing in this area of practice.
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay. So as I walked round and past her, I slapped her on the head. Then as she stepped out, I attacked her and knocked her down. She started getting up and shouting, "What the hell are you doing?" For about 30 seconds, perhaps a bit more, we were having a right scrap. She was on the floor scratching me and I was knocking hell out of her. So what does that say to you about Colin's violence? Was he emotional when explaining that, Claire?
Victoria, no, he wasn't. He was very matter of fact about it. And as I said to you, he talked about ladling the cupfuls and then said about having the permission, that it would be a good thing almost. His mother-in-law felt it would get her down off her high horse. You know, that was how he explained it. That was the bit that stuck in my throat, if you will, I suppose, really. Just the abject abuse. It was horrible to hear. Yeah, so the need for power, making it sound like it was equal. Yeah, we were having a right scrap. Yeah, she was scratching me, I was knocking hell out of her.
Okay, so should we move on?
Yeah.
So critical junctures for Brian. This is what Brian spoke about, which felt like a turning point for him. We had an argument downstairs and she was really vociferous and angry. She went upstairs to the bathroom and then I thought, I'm going to bed and sort of keep out of her way type of thing. Then my wife came flying out of the bathroom and started screaming at me and shouting at me again. And for whatever reason, I just turned around and I went for her. Down about, I think, 4 stairs. I grabbed her by the throat, pinned her down, and that was the act of violence towards her as such. I didn't go beating her up but what I did was terrifying for her, because knowing what I know and being the way I am, I could quite easily have killed her. So should we listen to Colin's critical junctures and then sort of come back to this?
Good idea.
So Colin talks about reality clicked back in again and I got off her and walked away. She was crying on the floor and that was it. I was just lost. I'd lost my brain. What have you done? I was totally at 6s and 7s. And then he says, when it first happened, as he's talking about the first incident of violence or the early incidences of violence, I knew it was wrong and I went to seek help at the Citizens' Advice, which would put it around the end of the late 60s. I might have talked to the wall for all the good it did. I came out of there realising that I wasn't really going to get any help. And I've tended to use that over the years, I think, as a bit of a crutch. Because I couldn't get any help then, I told myself it wasn't important. So I think that's all we've got on critical junctures. And then the points at which Brian and Colin thought, I need to do something about this. This is, I get a sense through all of their narratives, actually, that they've always had that sense of ambivalence. but this was a point at which the change talk outweighed anything else, and the sense of awareness that this is not okay was quite powerful for them.
Victoria actually made some really good comments there about makes you reflect on your own values and ethics and how this could potentially impact on practice, and that is no bad thing to reflect on, because
absolutely not.
You know, how can you hear all of these really well, just really horrible stories really without it having some impact on you, and then reflecting on whether that, if you reflect on that, then that's half the job, I suppose, isn't it, to trying to ensure that it doesn't impact on your practice. And Margaret mentioned Social Work England professional standards, and you know, we all have to adhere to those, but we can't not acknowledge the fact that this kind of work does have does push buttons for everybody in one way or another.
I think that's part of adhering to Social Work England standards, isn't it? Yeah. Actually, to think, how is this impacting on me? How am I thinking and feeling in this moment? When I leave this room, how am I thinking and feeling? How can I look after myself in this line of work? How does supervision with my manager help? How does peer supervision help? Because actually keeping ourselves safe is the only way we're going to help victims and partners and children be safer, which is why I'm in perpetrator programs that are respect accredited. It's really important to have a real set of supports around the people facilitating the program. So we had program managers, clinical supervisions, and treatment management, and it's really important, because the work can be quite hostile. It's very nuanced. There's no hiding place for your brain, because you have to think all the time really carefully, and it's doable and it's manageable and it's survivable, but it does need that level of really honest, sometimes frightening self-reflection, and a really clear support network around people that just somebody saying to me, nothing's normal in this work, Margaret, it's okay that you feel that way. It helped me not feel frightened of it. Okay, so I think for both Brian and Colin, there was a point at which they realised they needed to seek help, and turning points are very different for different people, aren't they? Some people talk about a turning point being social services involvement, and they might not have welcomed social services involvement or being referred to a programme in the first instance, but something about the process of working with people and the way they were worked with created or helped them create for themselves that turning point where they could start to think about their behaviour differently and perhaps start to work towards behaviour change, or to a point where they wanted to engage with the programme or be referred to a programme. So there are sometimes, even though it feels like people may be not wanting to see us in the first instance, for want of a better word, I think there's something we can do to support them through that process, elicit and explore their ambivalence, deal with them as a person who's valid with some strengths, who's probably not been abusive every time they've felt challenged or confronted actually, but has been on other occasions. So we can think about where their strengths are and where their own tolerance levels are, and use that to help to engage with them. Then we can think about, are they at a position now where we can start to talk about onward referral? And obviously as social workers, I guess we're not doing the behaviour change work, but we can certainly help support them towards behaviour change and towards accessing the right kind of support to work towards behaviour change for themselves. Is this making sense? Yeah? So let's move on. Let's talk about desist. This is the last point. Sorry. So desistance and maturation and completion of treatment programmes. So Brian says, I never consider myself to be the finished article. He says it never leaves you, you've just got to control it. And he says that he's in a position at the point where Claire interviewed him, where Sandra would be able to tell him, you're slipping back to your own ways. For him, age didn't feature in relation to change or desistance. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to confess it. I do have dyslexia, and I wrote this. So I've not picked up some of the typos. I'll sort it out and send it again, Janine.
It's okay.
Colin says, I've cleared the skeletons out of the cupboards, but I'm not saying I've cleared them all out. And there has been further incidents of abuse post-completion of the programme that he attended. He talks about settling down as he got older, meaning that these things were getting fewer and fewer. And I think there's a note here for Colin that he's talking about reduction, not cessation, and he was actually older himself in that older bracket when he self-referred, yes, following what he described as the worst attack ever. Mm-hmm. Okay.
So I just think the sort of takeaway message there, as I say, I keep coming back to this, interviewing 5 people, 2 of which were older, cannot be representative of the entire population. Of course it can't, but it's interesting to just keep in mind that it's not something that's done and dusted. That's it. You've done your programme, you're the finished article, because all 5 people said to me very clearly that's not the case, and these 2 were very clear about that.
Yeah. I think that's really important for them. It comes across in the programs I've been involved with as well that it's a lifelong process. You know, it's for many men, it's a process of really working on this on a daily basis. Okay. So should we just move on then? Because there's not much coming in the chat. Nicola says they come across as bullies who've got away with this behaviour for years. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I suppose we're not trying to present perpetrators with a particular picture here. I think that's really important to say. Our slant is nothing in this. The slant of interviewing Brian and Colin had no slant on it. It was just them telling their stories and understanding their narrative so that we can think about it and reflect on it and consider what it means for practice. I think it's probably, in fairness to them, also important to remember that they were casting their minds back to points in time where their abuse was at its worst when in parts of their narrative. So that's probably important to bear in mind as well. And it does, I think, Lisa, it does emphasise for me the need to think carefully about safeguarding and supporting people who are on the receiving end of their behaviours.
It's interesting what Georgia, what you're saying there. I think we need to understand the perpetrators would have been used to this abuse in their past. In all, in the 5 that I interviewed, and again, you know, only 5, they talked about things like being bullied at school. 2 of them did. None of them told me, I mean, that doesn't mean it didn't happen, but none of them told me about particularly witnessing domestic abuse in their families, between parents or carers, or anything else like that. So I'm not saying that that's not the case, but you know, they didn't. So just to add that comment.
Yeah, can I just raise a couple of things at this point? David Gadd from the University of Manchester did a piece of research called Boys to Men, and he was very clear that there's no causal link between experiencing abuse or witnessing abuse as a child and becoming a perpetrator in adult life. In fact, I remember going to the launch event for that research. It was a few years ago now, and many people in the audience were saying, look, I witnessed abuse as a child, I'm not a perpetrator. And David Gadd was really clear, there is no proven causal link between the 2. So I guess when working with individuals, it's about what does this mean for you and what has this meant for you, and which is possibly more the job of a behaviour change programme or a therapist, depending on which behaviour change programme they're in. And I know that different programmes run very differently. They have very different content, actually. The programmes I've been aware of across the piece can be very, very different. There was a comment there that also struck me as, if the violence is reduced, then has coercive controlling behaviours reduced? And that's, if you look at the Mirabelle research that was done by Nicole Westmoreland and colleagues from the University of Durham, which has a full report, they identified that physically abusive and sexually abusive behaviours did decrease, but there was less impact on coercive controlling behaviours and less impact on financial abuse. And worryingly for me in that research, the children said they didn't feel any safer. So certainly I remember when that report came out in the programme I was involved with, we were really careful to think about what does this mean for us, actually, which bits are we getting right and how might we need to work differently to think about the areas that are not changing. Is there something that we're missing here? And I think it's very much a work in progress, I would say. That, if you look at the Mirabel, M-I-R-A, is it Mirabel? M-I-R-A-B-A-L. Mirabel. Yeah. I can find that link and put that in the chat. Just out of interest as well, folks, if you're interested in modern slavery, David Gadd's just done some research with perpetrators of modern slavery, which I'll try and look up and send to you, Ginny, because I'm mindful that exploitation was something people wanted to look at. I was at we were presenting the DASK research at a conference David Gadd was at, and he was presenting his latest modern slavery research, which was interviews with perpetrators. It's really interesting. I think that's $1 million question, Victoria, isn't it, about how trauma impacts and what it means for individuals. I think it's a very nuanced, complex, long topic. I think for me it's about working with the individual and understanding what's going on for them.
I think George is asking a brilliant question, and if I knew that, I probably might have retired by now, to be honest. But where does it come from? Eh? You what?
Where does what come from? Sorry, Georgia, I'm not...
Domestically abusive behaviour, yeah. You know, where does, if a perpetrator hasn't had an abusive past, why do they display this behaviour? What do you hear from them? And it's a lot of things that we probably haven't... Well, we haven't fully researched in this piece of research at all. This was just asking about their trajectory, pathway, if you will, to being a perpetrator. But
there is a ton of research about typologies of domestic abusers, some of which is done through psychometric testing, some of which is done through interviews with victims and survivors, some of which is done through qualitative interviews with perpetrators. And there's a huge amount of that I mean, you're all graduates. You could all use your alumni accounts, I guess, to sort of look into some of that. All I would say is when you're looking at typologies, just think about how the research is done. Is it the voice of the perpetrator? Is it the voice of a victim survivor? Is there a comparison group, or is it psychometric testing? Because that stuff's really important. The perspective of the research is quite significant, I think.
And there's lots of stuff written, Georgia, as I'm sure you know, about the sort of what you might call the etiology of domestic abuse. So where does it come from? Why does it happen? You know, sociological explanations, feminist explanations. There's all sorts of different, partly what Margaret's saying there, I suppose, lots of different explanations for why it happens.
And some people would dispute that domestic abuse is gendered, and some people would really hold the line that domestic abuse is gendered.
And I'll be honest,
I find it very hard not to say it's gendered, listening to what I've heard over the years.
I don't know how helpful for me, I can't say for anybody else, I don't know how helpful it is for me to know kind of why it happens. In a way, I'm more interested in how it happens and how people can get over those social blocks that say this is wrong. How do they climb over those blocks and still do it? So it's more like about how can they do it and how do they do it rather than the reasons why they do it, almost, I think. Do you know what I mean? If that makes sense. Should we move on, Margaret? It's 20 past nearly.
We're nearly done. We're nearly done. Yeah. Okay. So can I just ask you, before we go to the next slide, can I just ask you, what do you think the point of talking to perpetrators is? When you're having conversations with them in your practice, what are you doing it for? While you're thinking about that and putting some comments in the chat, what is the purpose of those conversations? Risk management, yeah. To find out what needs to change in society to eliminate this behaviour. Gain understanding, to understand their behaviours and start them learn to change, to find out levels of risk and triggers. To help us understand how we can support. Yeah. Reduce impact on partners. I mean, the purpose of working with perpetrators, the primary purpose for me is about helping women and children and partners be safer. Long-term change, understanding healthy relationships, help them to learn the impact of their behaviours on others. Yeah. So can I just come to our slide on that then? Would that be okay? I realise I'm not on slideshow, but that's okay, isn't it? So just thinking about the nature and purpose of the conversation, obviously that's going to be determined in part by your role. And it's all the things you've said, really, to understand risks to partners and children, to reduce risks, to safeguard, to encourage change, to promote responsibility. Is it to defend victims? And, you know, when we hear the power of the narratives of Brian and Colin, I think there is that temptation to want to defend victims, which actually, if we don't think very carefully about what defend victims mean and the place of victims in our work, we might be in the position where we could create that psychological reactance or dip into sort of the righting reflex, you know, where we start to correct people, which research says doesn't work. So I think victims have to be at the forefront, but how we engage with that in our narratives is really important. Because what we don't want is to create, and somebody once said this to me as well, and it was helpful for me to hear, what you don't want, Margaret, is to create a load of angry perpetrators that are going to run around and reconstitute themselves by harming other people, which is quite a stark piece of feedback for me, actually, at the time. To learn more about the circumstances and to understand if and how risks can be managed. Okay, so let's just talk about some key learning for today. The key point of this slide is that understanding the central context and dynamics of domestic abuse is important, I think, because I think it's key to safeguarding and what's the right type of support for this family, for this person, for the people involved in this situation. So I think in terms of working with perpetrators, and Claire, I know you'll agree with this, I think, is relational work and working alliances are important with perpetrators. Having a clear focus about our rationale for talking to them is important. If we're not a therapist or a behaviour change programme, then what is our particular role in working with perpetrators, and how do we sit in the framework of the multi-agency network that works with perpetrators in the criminal justice system and the private, voluntary and independent sector? I think identifying and working with turning points is something that social work can do. We can listen for that, we can hear that, and we can think about how we work with that. I do think that we have to have a notion of safety planning with perpetrators, and I know we can think about safety planning with victims, and I think we're perhaps more used to doing that. I might be wrong, forgive me if I am, but I do think that safety planning at some level with perpetrators in a social work context is important, because when we talk to them, they may be rattled, they may be disturbed, and we need to think about that from a trauma-informed perspective, actually, about people's stress levels. And, you know, that Dave, I can't remember the name of the guy now, but who has the hand model of the brain. I'll find his name and I'll send it to Janine. But in terms of stress and that flipping the lid model of the brain, we need to think about making sure we regulate start and end of interviews with perpetrators. I think there can be some risks of engaging for us, and we've thought about that, and we've thought about the importance of support and self-care. And I think it's about awareness of ongoing risks, even where somebody's been through a programme. It's important about being aware of ongoing risks. I think
that's just add one point, Margaret.
Yes, certainly, absolutely.
So, because we are talking about older perpetrators, and I realise that some people who are here will work with older people. You know, I think traditionally, maybe domestic abuse has been seen as something that young men do. But there does need to be an acknowledgement, you know, that these two were in the mid-60s and mid-70s and were actively abusing, if you will. So it's just that challenging that narrative, I suppose, that it's a younger man's thing, if you don't mind me saying younger man's, because it does tend to be men. It's not, and it can be older men as well, and it can be long-standing behaviours as well that have been unchallenged or have been difficult to challenge or have not had that opportunity, really. So it's just being open-minded to that, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know if any of you have booked onto Khadija Chandler's sessions for the HALT project, the domestic homicide programme, but there was a lot of really important findings there around domestic homicide, particularly for adult services, actually, and about the coexistence of things like mental health and alcohol use. So I think Khadijah's work builds on this. It's a really, really good study, the whole study, actually. I wasn't involved in it, so I'm not biased at all, but I did go to their dissemination event, and it was incredibly powerful. It was a fabulous piece of work. They've looked at a large number of domestic homicide studies in depth and drawn out key learning from them. And they do have a website, which if you go to any of the sessions, Khadijah will give you. But what they did was they also spoke to people who've been bereaved through domestic homicide. And they took the words of survivors and they made it into poetry, which is available on the website. It's really, really powerful. Had these cases ever been through the criminal justice? I don't know. Those are questions for you, Claire.
The 5 that I presume you mean the 5 that I interviewed, Nicola. No, there had been interfaces with the police. One of these people, one of these 2 that we're talking about, got a caution. Do you remember what he said about his caution, Margaret?
That he put it on the wall.
He framed it and displayed it on his office wall. I said, I didn't know you actually got a certificate if you got a caution. That was news to me. I thought it was something that was on your criminal record. But he tried to tell me that he had a certificate that said he had a caution, an adult caution, and he hung it up on his office wall to remind him of the seriousness of his behaviour. The other guy had never been involved with I don't think, were the police called? I can't remember. No, I think the other guy, the police were called, and for a while his wife went to live in refuge accommodation and then came back. None of them had been, you know, prosecuted or been to prison or anything like that. They were all on a voluntary programme. That's interesting, Victoria. Yeah. Absolutely. It's just it just so isn't. It just so is not only younger men. Why would it be in many ways? You know, that's why I was saying about desistance. People might age out of crime or criminal behaviour, but not necessarily. And maybe domestic abuse is an exception to that.
I think some of the lessons from domestic homicides are around that, isn't it? It's about making sure that it's kept in focus. This thing about routine or selective inquiry, that just routinely having an awareness that anywhere we go in social work, because it's so cross-cutting, isn't it? Domestic abuse, it might be there. So without wishing to judge people or prejudge them as violent, just be aware and have that as part of the hypothesis and part of the professional curiosity.
Yeah.
I think if you wanted any one book on perpetrators, I'm just trying to find the book I'd recommend. It's John Devaney's book.
Oh, it's good. Yes. What's it called?
I can't remember what it's called. I'm going to find out. Bear with me.
We were looking at it the other day.
I know. And you could also think about the Respect helpline for perpetrators as well, by the way, which is free for them to access.
Is it the Domestic Violence Perpetrators, Devaney and Lazenblatt?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what it's called, Domestic Violence Perpetrators. Oh, there's Domestic Violence Perpetrators, Evidence Informed Responses. I liked that one. But they're both by John Devaney anyway.
I think it's Evidence Informed Responses.
Yes, it is, Ellen. Yeah, that's one of the 2, yeah. Yeah. I'm sure in that book somewhere at the start, he makes the point that perpetrators are a really under-researched group.
He does.
In terms of qualitative stories, because that's what, you know, when I was doing these interviews, I remember reading that and thinking, well, we might have lots of statistics and numbers, but what we haven't got is their stories, the qualitative stuff, and that's really important. Right, there we are.
I'm trying to find the exact reference, but I can't find it. I'll have to put it in the chat, because you'll all have the chat afterwards, and I'll get it from the library and put it in the chat for you.
Okay. Any final messages or final comments? We're 2 minutes from ending, so. Okay.
Janine, do you want to wrap up maybe if I stop screen sharing?